Hello and welcome to African Perspective, the program that looks at stories on the continent. I'm Alvin St-Pierre. Tonight on the show, we look at the tense political climate in Zimbabwe. We're also bringing you a wrap of events in East Africa and West Africa with a special attention on Nigeria. We are also in conversation with the former IEC Deputy Chairperson who is currently heading up the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa. You remember that you can be part of the conversations. You can send us your questions as well as your comments at African Perspective 1 on Twitter. But first, we start here. Political horse trading, faltering peace, a revolution that ousted a sitting president, a Nobel Peace Laureate and the world's fastest man. These are just some of the East African issues that grabbed world headlines, as reported by East African team of reporters, Sarah Kimani, as well as the cameraman, Johnson Baraza. Let's take a look.
Just as East Africa was settling into the new year, gunmen stormed an upmarket hotel and office complex in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, killing 21 people. The Al-Shabaab militant group claimed responsibility for the attack on Dusit D2 Hotel in Riverside, Nairobi. The attack came on the eve of a verdict in the trial of 3 men accused of aiding the Al-Qaeda-linked militant group in yet another deadly assault on Kenyan soil, the 2013 Westgate Mall attack, in which 67 people were killed. In March, the region, and indeed the world, was in shock following the news that an Ethiopian Airlines plane, Boeing 737 MAX, had crashed a few minutes after takeoff from Addis Ababa. All the 157 people on board the ill-fated plane died. They included 32 Kenyans, 18 Canadians, 9 Ethiopians, 8 each from China, the United States and Italy, 7 each from France and Britain, 6 from Egypt, 4 each from India and Slovakia, among others. Investigators blamed the Boeing 73 MAX flight control system for the accident, as well as a similar one in Indonesia in October 2018, in which over 194 people died. In December, Boeing announced they would suspend production of their 737 MAX airliner starting in January next year. In April, Sudan's military ousted dictator President Omar al-Bashir after months of anti-government protests against his 3-decade rule. A military council took over power for a 2-year transitional period. In December, al-Bashir was convicted of corruption and illicit possession of foreign currency, and he was sentenced to 2 years of detention in a reform facility. The presiding judge also ordered the confiscation of millions of euros and Sudanese pounds found in Bashir's residence when he was toppled. In neighboring South Sudan, President Salva Kiir and his rival, rebel leader Dr. Riek Machar, failed to agree on the formation of a unity government in May, forcing the U.S. to recall its envoy to Washington for consultations. The recall has been followed by sanctions against individuals the U.S. says are stalling the peace process and the formation of the unity government. Having missed the May 12 deadline set in the peace agreement to form a unity government, the leaders set themselves a November 12 deadline, which was missed as well. The leaders were given another 100 days by the African mediators to form the government. South Sudan watchers, however, say it is unlikely that South Sudan will resolve all the outstanding issues within 100 days. In Ethiopia, Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed's peace efforts paid out. Abiy won the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize in October for his peacemaking efforts, which ended the 2 decades of hostility with Ethiopia's longtime enemy, Eritrea.
I was a young soldier when war broke out between Ethiopia and Eritrea. I witnessed firsthand the ugliness of war in frontline battles. There are those who have never seen war but glorify and romanticize it. They have not seen the fear. They have not seen the destruction or heartbreak, nor have they felt the mournful impotence of war after the carnage.
In sports, Kenya's Olympic marathon champion Eliud Kipchoge made history in October as he became the first athlete to run a marathon in less than 2 hours in Vienna. Kipchoge will be back in London in April to defend his title. On that winning note, we end this year's coverage from the East African region. See you next year. Sarah Kimani for SABC News in Kenya.
And 2019 marked Nigeria's 6th election in 20 years since Africa's biggest democracy returned to civilian rule after decades of military government. Incumbent president emerged victorious as once again was bestowed with the responsibility of ensuring security and economic growth in the country. But as the year runs out, critics say not much progress have been made so far. Respondent Ajak Mangut reports from Abuja.
Supporters of Nigeria's ruling party, the All Progressive presidential candidate Muhammadu Buhari at a campaign rally in January 2019. By February, elections were held and Mr. Buhari returned as president for the second time. The president again promised to improve security and boost the economy.
We intend to pursue policies that will generate massive employment for millions of our youth. We shall also continue with greater determination and focus to pursue our goals of ensuring improved security for our country and its citizens, and without letting up on our fight against corruption.
I need to state that this
in March, the main opposition party, People's Democratic Party, and its candidate Atiku Abubakar went to court to contest President Buhari's victory. Mr. Atiku said the election was a sham and the result unacceptable because it was marred with violence and malpractice. President Buhari, however, maintained it was free and fair. Analysts say although the election was largely peaceful, there were also lots of problems.
There were still the familiar logistical challenges, violence, vote trading, and poor voter turnout. Was it a failed exercise? No, it wasn't. But was it a significant improvement on 2015? No, it wasn't.
In May, President Buhari once again recited the oath of office guided by the acting Chief Justice. 12th as Nigeria's New Democracy Day. In July, Boko Haram killed 65 people at a funeral in Borno. The incident marked a 10-year campaign of terror by the insurgent group. Despite notable military advances against Boko Haram, experts say changing tactics from physical combat may go a long way in winning the war.
There has to be a collaboration between the government and the Muslim community around the Sahel to roll back some of these extremist doctrines that are only found in mainstream Muslim theology. And until there's a rollback, what you find is that for every insurgent that is mowed down on the battlefield, there are tens, if not hundreds of replacements willingly.
In September, the Federal Executive Council approved an increase in value-added tax rate from 5% to 7.2% to increase revenue. The additional income will fund the Social Investment Program, which is targeted at lifting 100 million Nigerians out of poverty within the next 10 years. Nigeria also closed its land borders in October to stop smuggling of staple foods like rice into the country and boost local production. However, experts say the government should focus more on improving the power sector and develop infrastructure.
Let power be stable in Nigeria. You will take out most of the unemployment individuals that you have. If power is stable, industry and manufacturers will be able to employ more people. You see new set of businesses. That's if you fix power, then you can use the energy in power or even outside power to fix the rail system for your big city that are now becoming insufficient.
In December, the National Assembly passed the 2020 Appropriation Bill, igniting the government's hope of returning the budget cycle from January to December.
Many Nigerians who voted to extend the tenure of President Buhari this year are hoping that he's able to bring about a better livelihood for the entire Nigerian people in the next few years. And experts say a good performance in the direction of the economy and security will ensure that he lives up to these expectations. Ajek Mangut, SABC News, Abuja.
They need to step up and take responsibility.
He believes that these banks were actually enablers of state capture.
I met senior directors of HSBC and Standard Chartered. I found a great reluctance from both of them.
Reverend Frank Chikane was very actively involved in calling out state capture.
The Guptas would tell you, if you don't do what we want by Wednesday, you won't be a director general.
The murder case has implicated some senior public servants. Tell us more.
Indeed, this case has gained more traction, as we see, after an auditor has testified on the financial flows between Siemens and Bagili.
Department of Community Safety, Security and Liaison and the Department of Health had promised that it will strengthen security in all hospitals in the province. That has not yielded any positive results.
Our job as the SA Today team doesn't simply start when the cameras start to roll. We also work tirelessly behind the scenes to keep you up to date with stories of the day.
What have you established as an organization, or rather as an association, regarding this WhatsApp group Stokvel?
If you look at the WhatsApp Stokvels, people join irrespective of whether they know each other or not. So the person joining is faceless. The one recruiting is also faceless. It's a disaster.
Watch SA Today every day from 3 p.m.
Welcome back. You're still watching African Perspective with me, Aldrin Simpier. Elections are supposed to give the voice to ordinary citizens to make their choice on who should govern in their respective countries. And for this to happen, the electoral bodies must be credible and independent. But in recent times, electoral commissions on the continent have come under fire for failing to administer elections in a credible manner. To discuss this and other issues related to elections, we are now joined in our Cape Town studios by Terry Zilani, who is from the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa, who has a vast experience in administering elections, as well as the former chairperson of the South African Independent Electoral Commission. Mr. Tilani, good evening and welcome to African Perspective. Let's start. Yes, it's just been over, 3 months since the launch of this particular company. How's it been so far?
It's been wonderful. I think the reception, largely from people all over the continent, as well as in South Africa, has really been positive. I think clearly there's been a gap in the market where people wanted an independent voice that can actually credibly speak about the electoral processes. And I think the establishment of the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa, IMSA, has actually provided that platform. And that's why even in the past weekend, the EFF had actually requested us to run their processes. And it's always wonderful when political parties subject themselves to an independent voice in order for them to be able to manage their democratic processes.
Was this the first political party that IMSA has done the oversight role of elections in?
Well, it is the first political party that we are running or administering the elections for. But ahead of the 2019 elections, we actually trained the party agents of the Inkatha Freedom Party. But in terms of running the electoral processes, EFF was actually the first organization that gave us this opportunity.
And what was that experience like?
It's been great. It's been fantastic, and I think the reception has been wonderful. And, you know, when we started with this process, the only request that was made to us was that, by the leadership of the EFF, was that we should run the process with professionalism and integrity,
And then clearly that resonated with our own ethos as IMSA. And we found it much more easier to work with the EFF because that's what they said they wanted to see. And we provided them that because everybody who has actually witnessed this process can actually attest to the fact that indeed we ran these elections with professionalism and integrity.
Before we go back to the politics of administering elections, I was quite interested to find out that actually IMSA is also working with private companies and their electoral systems.
Absolutely. We have a joint venture with INS. INS is a communications company, but that relationship that we have has enabled us to develop electronic systems. So we're not only dealing with manual processes when administering the elections. Now, as a result of the input and relationship that we have as a result of that joint venture, we are able now to move into electronic voting, which I think is part of what I regard as part of the future.
And speaking about electronic voting, do you think that South Africa is ready for that?
Absolutely. I mean, you saw during the past elections the kind of the challenges and difficulties that the IEC had. And I think on the basis of those challenges, everybody can now say, indeed, it is important that we begin to move into the future. And electronic voting is the only way that can actually be able to assist in terms of efficiently and effectively running the electoral processes.
Then how do you ensure that there's confidence in an electronic system? Looking, for instance, in Namibia, they use the electronic system, but there are still those who are naysayers who believe that there could be, that the electronic system could be intercepted by foreign agents.
Well, it depends, because you see, when we talk about the electronic system, sometimes people think it is just one thing throughout the world. You've got different types of electronic mechanism that we can introduce in the elections. The one that I normally emphasize is a possibility of having a paper trail. In other words, you introduce something almost similar to what you have as ATM, at the ATM where you withdraw money and then you've got a receipt. So you go into a ballot or into a ballot booth, you press for the political party that you want to vote for. It gives you a receipt. You authenticate that receipt by stamping it at the back, and then you put it into the ballot box. And then if there is a query, you can go back to that ballot box and count. But as you vote, you are actually, at the same time, counting the votes and transmitting the election results. So it is much more easier if you're using that kind of a system in order to deal with the issues of trust, because the biggest problem with electronic voting, as we clearly pointed out, is the issue of trust. Do people trust those who are running the process, that they will do it without manipulating the system, and also that there cannot actually be interference from other forces? It is therefore important that you don't dismiss these people outrightly, but you provide mechanisms and processes that will make people begin to trust the system.
Trust, obviously, very important when it comes to running elections. And what we've seen as we came to this introduction to this interview is that what's happening on the continent is that there's a lack of trust in the different electoral commissions on the continent. Look, for instance, what has happened in Kenya, what has happened just right next door in Zimbabwe as well.
Definitely. I think, there are quite a number of things that election management bodies have got to introduce in order to be able to deal with that issue. Take, for instance, the situation in Kenya. In Kenya, they had a problem with what they call Form 34A and 34B. 34A and 34B basically are just, in simpler terms, the result slips. So you've got the result slips from the voting stations, and we've got the result slips from the constituencies. And then what the Electoral Commission was supposed to have done with those result slips is to reconcile them with the electronic results. And then they did not do that. Now, how can people trust that, in fact, the election management body has given them the proper results when they've actually not done any reconciliation? So as a result of that, the court obviously nullified those results on the basis that the Electoral Commission is supposed to have reconciled those results before issuing them. You know, so that's a problem sometimes in the continent where the election management bodies are not thorough. They don't do things that are supposed that are expected of them. They don't apply the law consistently, and they don't seem to understand some of the processes that are important and critical for the credibility and integrity of the process.
This then goes to the heart of the question that always comes up before the appointment of the commissioners of these various electoral commissions, and that is the process and the integrity of the people who are appointed to these positions and the political influence that plays a role on who then eventually becomes part of the electoral commissions.
It's a very critical point. I mean, let's take, for instance, Zimbabwe. You know, in order to have a credible elections, I always emphasize this issue. And as IMSA, what we have done is that we have now developed what we call integrity wheel. This integrity wheel basically defines critical aspects that define the integrity of the elections. Now, one of the issues which is critical is the voters' roll. Now, in Zimbabwe, for a long, long time, the Electoral Commission was not even responsible for the voters' roll. Sorry. The voters' roll was managed by a statistician general in Zimbabwe. So, and the statistician general, who was a person who is associated with the ZANU-PF, was a person who was not able to make even the voters' roll available to the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission only saw the voters' roll on the day of the elections. Now, can you imagine going into the elections? Those who are participating in the elections don't know who is eligible and who is ineligible to participate in those elections. If the political parties don't have a voters' roll and they only see the voters' roll on the day of the elections, how are they going to ensure that those who do not qualify do not participate in the process? And how are they going to make sure that those that are supposed to have been part of the process are actually able to get into the voters' roll? So that's the kind of the difficulties that we have in the continent. And that in particular in Zimbabwe, it is one of the challenges that the Electoral Commission in Zimbabwe had.
Yeah. And also the ability of the Electoral Commission or whoever's in charge of the voters' roll to reconcile who's actually still alive.
Definitely. And that's what I'm saying, you know, it is one of the problems in the continent. Let's look also in the case of Ghana. Ghana, there is a gentleman called Abu Ramadan who took the Electoral Commission of Ghana to court, and on the basis that in the voters' roll, or what they call the voter register, you had the deceased people, you had people who are underage, and then you also had people who had actually registered using NHI, or National Health Insurance card, which was actually outlawed by the Supreme Court of Ghana. Now, if you have a voters' roll that is not current, that has got so many inconsistencies and problems, how do you then expect to have a credible process? Voters' roll plays a very important role in the integrity of the electoral process. And therefore, the electoral management bodies, they've got to make sure that the first thing that they focus on is to make sure that the voters' roll is current and that it only contains the name of those people who are supposed to be there. But it's not only the problem in other parts of the continent. Remember that in South Africa as well, the Electoral Commission had problems in Tlokwe where they, where we, because I was still part of the Electoral Commission, we did not actually provide the political parties with the voters' roll with addresses. And that became a problem that almost derailed the 2016 local government elections. So it's a critical aspect. We've got to make sure everywhere in the continent that election management bodies focus on the list of those people who are supposed to be participating in the electoral process.
Two critical stakeholders during an election is, of course, the observers that would be there, and I'd like you to just quickly comment on the credibility of the observers as well, who are allowed to come and observe the elections, but also the role that's played by the court. You've already mentioned, for instance, what has happened here in South Africa with the Constitutional Court judgment, what has happened in Kenya with the court there setting aside the election, as well as the victory of Uhuru Kenyatta as president of Kenya. And then on the other end, in Zimbabwe as well, where the Constitutional Court again had to intervene after there were complaints around the credibility of the elections.
election observers, I maintain, they've got to go through a process of introspection. You may recall that a few years back in Tanzania, the Electoral Commission of Tanzania nullified the election results of Zanzibar. And this is after all the election management bodies had actually declared those election results valid and free and fair. Now, if you have a situation where election management bodies declare the results of an election to have been free and fair, and then the election management body actually nullify them on the basis that the irregularities were such that they could not declare those results free and fair, then it means you've got a problem. And instead of the election observers doing that introspection, they were actually questioning the motives of the election management body in terms of nullifying the election results. Now, I'm saying to you, or suggesting to you that these bodies, they've got to begin to look at whether they really understand what they are observing. They've got to understand the standards that they're actually applying to observe the elections. And I think to a large extent in the continent, people only focus on one aspect, it is peace. You will find that most of the time when the observer missions declare the results, they will say the results were peaceful and credible and therefore reflect the will of the people. But they don't look at all other aspects. As I've said to you, you've got the integrity will that basically develops the framework within which the elections have got to be assessed. And that integrity will that we have developed, we believe it's an innovation that will help even the election observers to be able to assess the integrity and credibility of the elections using the innovation that we have introduced as IMSA.
Quickly speak to us about the role of the courts, because as the final arbiter when it comes to the election results and the declaration of the election results or disputes over the election results, they play quite a critical role. In Zimbabwe, there was people were battling to understand the Constitutional Court judgment around the elections. However, though, in Kenya, when the Constitutional Court there set aside the election of Uhuru Kenyatta as president, there were celebrations. So there are some people who are quite cynical about political interference even within the judiciary.
No, I think that concern is actually misplaced. We've got to understand that the courts play an important role as an oversight on the electoral processes. If the election management bodies do not run the elections according to the law, then the only platform available to those people who are disaffected by the decisions of the Electoral Commission is the courts. So we must allow people to be able to utilize the courts. And in fact, even in the African Charter on Democracy and Elections, this issue is emphasized that those who are disaffected by the decisions of the Commission in relation to how the elections were administered, they must have a platform, they must go to the courts, they must be able to raise those issues through legal processes. And therefore, it is important that we respect the decisions of the courts. The courts are the final arbiters in terms of the process, because if you don't have the courts playing that role, then it means people are basically going to be going to the streets if they're not happy with the outcome of the results of the elections.
Yeah, and very important to that as well is the participants in the elections and those who may argue that the elections were not credible, they were not free and fair. How do you get to a point where you actually get these politicians to accept the outcomes of an election?
The political parties must accept the outcome of the results of the elections. And then if they are not happy with the outcome of the results of the elections, the only recourse available to them is to go to the courts and to present valid reasons why they doubt the outcome of the results of an election. If they don't do that and only scream in the streets, they can cause a lot of stability to a democracy.
But in Zimbabwe that happened, and Nelson Chamisa from the MDC Alliance, they were still quite clear that they do not accept the results.
Utilize that. I beg yours?
I was saying that that happened in Zimbabwe, where they went to go and challenge the outcome of the results. And even though the Constitutional Court found that there was, well, at least nothing of significance that would have changed the outcome of the elections, they still cried foul. And that's the reason why we have the political impasse that we see in Zimbabwe today.
Yeah, but you see, the issues that I'm raising are applicable not only to the ruling party or parties in the continent, but they're applicable to all participants in the democratic process. Those who are in opposition and those who are in power, they've got to understand that they can be the referee and players at the same time. So you are a player, and when you are disaffected with a decision, it is not your decision that will actually ultimately be an arbiter in a conflict. You've got to try to find someone else in order to subject your issues to those to that individual or to those individuals, and you've got to, like in any conflict situation, conflict management situation, once you have subjected yourself to an outsider to say, here are the facts, here are the issues that I'm complaining about, then you must accept the outcome of the decisions by that arbiter.
Yeah. Just quickly, the electoral reforms, we see that, for instance, in some countries, expats, people who are living outside of the country, are not allowed to participate in the election results. How important is this to ensure that even though you live outside the country, you are still recognized as a citizen from that country, and therefore your voice should also be heard?
Elections are always contextual. You've got different systems applicable to different people. In Australia, for instance, it is compulsory for people to participate in the elections. If you don't participate in the elections, you get punished for that. In certain countries, there is no capacity to cater for those who are outside the country. And in other countries, there is capacity. But what is important is that, mechanism must be put in place to try to make sure that every citizen who qualifies to participate in the political process is given a platform and opportunity to participate. But, you've got to take in consideration the resources that would be required to make that platform available to everybody.
In closing, what's on the cards for IMSA in the next year, 2020?
We are in discussions with ELECAM, which is the Electoral Commission of Cameroon. We have discussions also with Burundi and many other countries. So we are hopeful that some of these results, some of these discussions will produce positive results for the organization. But we are going to be focusing also in our own country. There are quite a number of areas and interventions that are required. And a body such as IMSA has a responsibility and an obligation to make sure that the gaps that are there in the democratic order are closed. We will therefore be making ourselves available to assist any institution that requires our assistance, but those that may not be aware of our role and responsibilities, we will be marketing ourselves even more aggressively so that people understand what our offerings are.
Thank you so much. That was Terry Zilani from the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa. When we come back, a focus on Zimbabwe.
Our job as the SA Today team doesn't simply start when the cameras start to roll. We also work tirelessly behind the scenes to keep you up to date with stories of the day.
What have you established as an organization, or rather as an association, regarding this WhatsApp group Stokvel?
If you look at the WhatsApp Stokvels, people join irrespective of whether they know each other or not. So the person joining is faceless. The one recruiting is also faceless. It's a disaster.
Watch SA Today every day from 3 p.m.
Welcome back to African Perspective with me, Aldrin St-Pierre. And remember that you can be part of the conversations on Twitter by tweeting @AfricanSpec1. That is @AfricanSpec1. Former President Thabo Mbeki has wrapped up his visit to Zimbabwe. The former president met President Emmerson Mnangagwa, opposition leader Nelson Chamisa, and other role players in that country. Zimbabwe is in the midst of an economic crisis. The recent doctors' strike has put a spotlight on some of the deeper issues, even for professionals.
You know, this is a private visit. I came here to see the president because I hadn't seen him here since he became president, as I said. So, but I know, as you know, I know many people in Zimbabwe, got many friends here, so lots of other people wanted to see me. So we've been talking to everybody, and everybody, of course, is interested to discuss the situation. I'm interested too in the situation here, just to understand what's happening and to say really basically we support the effort of the Zimbabweans to address their fundamental challenges, whatever the challenges are, that everybody gets together. So we've been listening to everybody. We haven't finished that listening process. So we'll come back again later this month to continue to finalize that. It's really a listening thing because we want to give whatever support we can so that, as I say, there are many people in Zimbabwe are saying that the country needs to address many challenges, whether they're of political reform, the economic, and so on. So we understand we're neighbors, and as I say, I have many friends in this country, I know many people, and I think we should give all the necessary support.
Is there hope for Zimbabwe?
Oh, I'm sure. I've got lots of confidence in the leadership of this country, all of the collective leadership, coming together as they've done in the past. There is a lot of capacity, lots and lots of capacity in the country to resolve all of these problems, all of the reforms that are needed, whether they are political or economic or whatever. I think it is possible. But we are listening. We'll come back later this month because we didn't finish it, because people now have left to go to prepare for the Christmas holidays. But we'll come back and talk a bit more.
Well, Zimbabwean author and analyst Brian Gagoro joins me now in studio. Good evening and welcome to African Perspective.
Thank you.
How would you characterize what's currently happening in Zimbabwe?
Well, we have a multi-layered crisis. You have a crisis within the health sector that's gone on for 5 months. It's early days to tell how many people are dying from preventable diseases because the hospital doors are literally locked. 7.7 million Zimbabweans are facing starvation because of the severe drought and other factors. There are intimations that we have less than 3 months grain supply for the country. And there's all likelihood that we will not be able, a lot of parents will not be able to send their children back into school. We've begun to see stunting in some children because there's just not enough money, not enough nutritious food. The cost of living has skyrocketed beyond the remit of any ordinary Zimbabwean. And that is one set of issues. And of course, you have the economy, which is again spiraling into hyperinflation. And you layer that with the governance challenges that we have seen in the recent past, the human rights violations, August 1, January. And so what Zimbabwe has managed to do in a very short space of time since the coup in November 20. Well, it was a coup. I don't think that we need to clothe it with any courtesy or euphemism. It was a coup. Since the coup in November 2017, what we've seen Zimbabwe do, because it garnered a lot of international goodwill, we've seen that goodwill squandered. And the squandering of the goodwill is as a result of the refusal to address, I think, 4 fundamental issues. The first one is a governance challenge that's been with the country for a very long time, since the inception of the colonial state. This idea, I call it a Stone Age mentality that depends on who has the larger stone or the bigger stick. That power is used not to construct national solutions, but to suppress any dissenting opinions. It doesn't matter who wields that power. The second issue beyond the governance crisis is that the economic trajectory that we have adopted since the structural adjustment programs, has set us on a course where we are unlikely to contain and to absorb and the aspirations of the bottom half of the country. That a few elites are going to primitively accumulate, be very comfortable, them and their cronies and their families. So the economic development paradigm and policy needs to go back to what the revolutionary aspiration was under the liberation movements, which was an egalitarian society in which the economy is based on care, on solidarity, and on inclusion. And you can't do it pursuing the Wall Street and the Washington consensus in a religious scale. So beyond the economic, there's a productivity question. Now, the productivity question is not a policy question. It's a factor related to enabling environment. The energy cost in the country, we destroyed Wange, we've destroyed other utilities through corruption and other factors that we could lend to enabling our industries, because we have highly productive folk in the country, highly competent professionals. The second thing that we could do is that instead of dealing with the agrarian question in its holistic sense, I think that we've always taken little small bites and thrown money at a problem. The productivity problem will not be solved by throwing money at it.
Do you think that the destruction of the tobacco sector as well would have led to this lack of production that you speak of?
Well, I mean, I have a nuanced view about where was the destruction.
Yeah.
You see, the fundamental issue that most people miss about Zimbabwe is that almost 70% of food for domestic consumption was from 1980 up to the 2000 produced by peasants. So what happened when we did the fast-track land reform program, and land reform was necessary in the country, we not only, because it also had a political objective, which was neutralizing what was seen as a growing support base for the labor-backed MDC within the farming community, especially amongst commercial farm workers, is that we destroyed a skills base within Zimbabwe's farm worker community. And our farms are located near rural areas. Those folks were highly skilled, were able, some of them were evicted. We destroyed the competence and the capacity of the Zimbabwean peasantry to feed itself and not have to rely on government. So whilst many people want to focus on the forex earning component, the tragedy that we face is not simply that the country is not generating sufficient forex. You'll know that 3 years ago, with less than 35% production or capacity rate, that Zimbabwe managed to produce tobacco, which was higher than its highest yields, which were in 1974, 72, 74. So the issue of productivity, whether it's done through outgrower schemes and so on and so forth, it's one issue. The bigger issue is the inability of a country which was known for one of the highest number of agriculturally trained professionals being unable to feed itself.
Let's fast forward then to 2019 and what's happened in Zimbabwe now over December with the visit of her former president, Thabo Mbeki. The question that I have in terms of his mediation is that, is he the right man to be mediating the current political impasse in Zimbabwe, considering his tenure as president of South Africa and the role that South Africa played during his tenure in 2002 as well as 2008. Let's not even forget the Gampepe report as well.
I think we've gone too far. The starting point is Mbeki is not mediating in Zimbabwe. Mbeki carries no mandate from the South African government, carries no mandate from SADC, carries no mandate from the African Union. The African Union has not discussed Zimbabwe. The SADC Troika has not discussed Zimbabwe. What the Mbeki visit is, it is a contact visit. And that's why he keeps emphasizing, we're here to listen, right?
Yeah.
And I have friends here. He's not saying I'm here on an official mandate.
Of listening?
No,
what does it do with the information?
So in a sense, what are called contact visits is that often when there is a mutually destructive political impasse, you can't immediately go into mediation because the tensions are so high and the agenda of various actors is blared. So what you need is somebody who goes in, listens, tries to distill without diluting what each sector of society thinks are the core issues that would or might constitute the agenda for dialogue. Now let's go back to the credibility question. The issue of previous engagement in Zimbabwe and the perception that South Africa aligned itself, whether ideologically or strategically, more with ZANU-PF, and that therefore its role was seen as tainted by that allegiance, is something that I think if President Mbeki were to go beyond contact visits and get a mandate to be a mediator, he would have to address frontally the idea that silent diplomacy enabled the deepening of the crisis. The idea that the non-release of the Kampempe report, because I assume for ideological reasons, we are responding to the imperial designs on Africa, that there were interests elsewhere outside of Africa that had designs on the country. That does not excuse, and Samora Machel captured it this way: we did not fight imperialism so that we could embrace indigenized oppression. And the dilemma of progressives in this region and South Africa, if it is to play any role in Zimbabwe or any person in SADC, is to remember that allegiance is based on ideological or historical factors, must not color our obligations under our respective constitutions and under the SADC and African Union protocols to ensure that the rights of human beings that are Africans are protected, to ensure that we hold each other to account. It should not be the business of the British or the Americans to hold errant regimes within our region to account. It is our comradely duty as revolutionary parties, as democratic parties, to hold each other to certain standards. If we don't hold the mirror,
then you ask yourself, what's the job of the African Review mechanism? Because it has been there, it's been established. Well, some would say that it's working, but what work is it doing if its recommendations are not being respected by states who argue that we are a sovereign state, and for that matter, our sovereignty must be respected?
So if you go back to Mbeki's earlier intervention that led to the 2000 and the GNU in Zimbabwe, is that if Mbeki were to be embraced as a mediator now, the first order of business is to go back to diagnosing why the recommendations and the agreements under the GNU were not implemented. Very few were implemented. The non-implementation of the GNU agreements is symptomatic of the fact that you cannot get a resolution to the Zimbabwean impasse unless if you get a guarantor. That there needs to be a monitoring and an evaluation mechanism that's independent of the control that we have seen of either of the parties in Zimbabwe. We need some form, and the African Union and SADC needs to remove itself from simply playing a solidarity role or fiddling whilst they're watching the situation. If the situation degenerates, we've seen situations degenerate in Sudan and elsewhere. The people,
and in Algeria as well.
The people will lose confidence in the premier continental institutions that are meant to be our primary defense against being recolonized by external factors. So it is important that in dealing with Zimbabwe, there be political astuteness, but there be honesty as well.
Do you think that there's space in Zimbabwe with all the political players, and since the 2018 elections that came out, to have what we saw in Kenya, the Building the Bridge initiative, between the warring factions, Raila Odinga as well as Uhuru Kenyatta, coming together and starting this process, which also then led to the recommendations around reforms that they'd like to see?
You see, the challenge in Zimbabwe is crudely what South Africans have called state capture. We are suffering from externalized factional battles within the ruling party. And that ruling party trying to engage an assault on its credence and its credibility by an opposition. So part of the resolution in Zimbabwe is not that Zimbabweans are incapable of talking. It is a small political elite. In 1979, this elite signed a pact in outside of Zimbabwe, made an agreement. There was a genocide, almost, 1984, Gukuraundi. In 1987, same elite signed a pact, the Unity Accord, and we know what happened when we went into 2000, right? And then we signed another pact in 2009, the GNU, we know what happened. In 2017, Zimbabweans celebrated thinking the solution had come through the coup. Now we saw August 1, we saw January. So my sense is the running thread throughout all of those is that until we solve the structural crisis, until we address the pervading governance question, state building and nation building in Zimbabwe has not been completed. The very fact that we still have parts of the country that feel so alienated that they want to form and to be left alone is a fundamental indictment on the failure of nation building. So it's not just social cohesion. It's not just hug and meet amongst the political elite. Right now, we know through the churches there is a national convergence platform. There are various platforms in which Zimbabweans across the political divide and ideological divide are coming together to say the crisis in our country requires that we agree and focus on what is the national question.
Okay. We're going to have to wait and see whether former President Thabo Mbeki would actually be able to lead them to that particular process. He did indicate that he'll be back in the country next year. That was Brian Kagoro, who's an author as well as an analyst. Well, she's black, she's ugly, and she's a downgrade. She's a boy lookalike. She has a 30 Rand haircut. Well, she's beautiful, and she is Miss Universe. Here is another moment to be inspired by Zozibini Tunzi. Get a double dose of the inspiration as she sits down with our daywalker, DW, Trevor Noah. Here are two South Africans who are taking the universe by storm. I'm personally inspired.
Welcome back to The Daily Show. My guest tonight recently became the third woman from South Africa to win the title of Miss Universe. Please welcome Miss Universe 2019, Zozibini Tunzi. This is amazing. You should come here every night. Just come and hang out every single night. Congratulations.
Thank you, Trevor.
Miss
Thank you.
Universe. Has it sunk in yet?
I don't think so. I think this is like my almost a week now. Yeah, and I think I'm getting used to it because at first people would be like, Miss Universe, and I'll just continue going because that's not me.
Miss Universe, you dropped something.
Is that me?
Jupiter, please, Miss Universe. But it is a surreal experience. I mean, like, because you won Miss South Africa, and then you go on this journey to, to compete for Miss Universe. And I mean, it's amazing women from all around the world. The competition has evolved over the years to become more about like what the women are thinking as well as how you look and what you want to do in the world. So it is a challenging experience to be on. Like, what was this journey? What has it been like for you?
Oof, it's been interesting since I won Miss South Africa and finding out that I would be doing Miss Universe as well. It was incredible, the support that I got from back home, but it was challenging as well because I had a new look that people were not used to. And so I got crowned and I got a lot of different responses, but I was quite excited about it regardless of